Silent. The murmurs stopped. Even the prosecutor's smirk wavered for a split second. Judge Grayson arched an eyebrow, leaning forward as if he hadn't heard correctly. You what? His voice was laced with both amusement and disbelief. I'll be representing myself, Jalen repeated, his tone steady, unwavering. His hands were still in his pockets, his posture calm. Too calm for a 19-year-old facing serious charges. Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. This isn't a TV drama, kid. You think you can just stroll in here and argue your way out of this? A few more chuckles rippled through the courtroom, but Jalen remained unfazed. He simply tilted his head slightly. With all due respect, Your Honor, isn't that exactly what lawyers do? The air shifted. The laughter died down. Even the stenographer hesitated for a fraction of a second before resuming typing. Judge Grayson's smirk faltered just a little. He studied Jalen, as if reassessing him. Fine, he said, waving a dismissive hand. Have it your way. But don't expect me to go easy on you. Jalen smiled, small, barely there. I wouldn't dream of it, Carrington scoffed, shaking his head as he returned to his table. This should be entertaining, he muttered under his breath. Jalen exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He had studied cases like this. He knew how prosecutors operated, how judges like Grayson played their roles. Now it was his turn. He walked toward the jury, pausing in front of them. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has painted a very compelling picture. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. Seems pretty straightforward, or does it? He let the words hang in the air, giving them time to sink in. But let's not just look at what they're saying, let's focus on what they're not saying. Judge Grayson narrowed his eyes. The prosecutor stiffened slightly. Jalen turned, pacing slowly. The state claims I was caught in a stolen vehicle. What they don't mention is that I wasn't the only one in that car. They haven't told you about the other fingerprints found, ones that don't belong to me. He gestured toward the prosecution's table. They haven't shown you the full report. They only gave you what benefits their case. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Carrington's jaw tightened. Jalen glanced at him. Would you like to present the full forensic report now, Mr. Carrington? Or should I? The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Judge Grayson's fingers drummed against the bench once more, this time with less amusement. Jalen continued, his voice calm but sharp. They also claim I ran from the police. That sounds bad, right? But what they won't tell you is why. He turned to the jury, holding their gaze. Let me ask you this. If you were sitting in a car, waiting for a friend, and suddenly, out of nowhere, police swarm in with their guns drawn, would you panic? More murmurs. Someone in the gallery nodded slightly. Jalen didn't stop. And Officer Ruiz, the one who supposedly saw me behind the wheel, did he see me driving? Or did he just see me in the car? He raised an eyebrow. There's a difference. The room grew still. Even Judge Grayson seemed to be reevaluating the situation. Jalen finally stopped pacing, turning to face the judge directly. Your Honor, the prosecution's case isn't built on facts, it's built on assumptions. And assumptions, he said, pausing for emphasis, aren't enough to convict me. Silence. Judge Grayson exhaled, rubbing his temple. Mr. Carrington, do you have a response? The prosecutor hesitated. His confidence wasn't as firm as before. He flipped through his notes, but Jalen already knew he had turned the case upside down. And just like that, the entire courtroom realized this wasn't just another clueless teen. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Testify in court. Judge Grayson glanced at Carrington, waiting for his response. The prosecutor stiffened slightly, his fingers tightening around his papers. The report itself is clear, Your Honor. There's no need for additional testimony. Jalen nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Interesting. He turned back to the jury, pacing deliberately. Because fingerprint analysis isn't as flawless as TV makes it seem, is it? His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. Let me ask you this. How many of you have ever left a glass on a table and then picked it up again later? He let the question linger. Did your fingerprints look exactly the same each time? A few jurors shifted in their seats. Someone in the gallery murmured. Jalen's voice remained steady. See, fingerprint matching isn't as simple as your print is there, so you did it. It's a process, one that depends on how clear the print is, how much of it was found, and whether there were other overlapping prints. He turned back to Carrington. Would you like to tell the court how many full prints were found on the steering wheel? Or should I? Carrington exhaled sharply, but Jalen didn't wait for his response. Because I have the forensic report right here. He tapped a document on the defense table. And according to this, only a partial print of my thumb was identified. A smudge. One single fragment of a fingerprint. The gallery erupted into whispers. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel once. Quiet. Jalen leaned slightly against the defense table, still speaking to the jury. So, what does that actually tell us? That I touched the car? Maybe. But that doesn't prove I drove it. It doesn't prove I stole it. It doesn't prove anything except that I was near it at some point. He folded his arms, his gaze unwavering. And yet, the prosecution wants you to believe that this one partial print, out of dozens of prints on that car, is enough to convict me? Carrington clenched his jaw. Your Honor, the fact remains that the defendant fled from officers when they attempted to detain him. Jalen tilted his head slightly. Fled. His voice was almost amused. Or reacted? Carrington scoffed. The officers gave chase because you ran. Jalen smiled, just barely. Or maybe I ran because the officers gave chase. Silence. He turned back to the jury. I was outside that store with my friends when suddenly, out of nowhere, squad cars surrounded us. No sirens, no warning, just men rushing in, shouting, demanding that we get on the ground. His jaw tightened slightly. Now, I don't know about you, but when a bunch of armed officers storm a parking lot, my first instinct isn't to calmly ask what's going on. My first instinct is fear. The weight of the room shifted again. Jalen's voice dropped slightly, controlled but firm. And let's talk about that pursuit for a second. The prosecution claims I was apprehended after a chase. But what they won't tell you is that I was only 2 blocks away when I stopped running. I didn't hide. I didn't resist. I didn't fight. I stopped because I realized something. If I didn't, I might not survive. A hushed stillness filled the courtroom. Even Judge Grayson was staring at him differently now. Jalen turned to Carrington. Tell me, prosecutor, do you have the officer's body cam footage from that arrest? Carrington hesitated, too long. Jalen took a quiet breath. Because if you did, the jury would see that I had my hands up before they even reached me. He turned back to the jury, his voice measured. Does that sound like a criminal trying to escape? Or does that sound like a kid who is scared out of his mind? Another pause. Another shift. Jalen let his hands drop to his sides, exhaling slowly. The prosecution built this case on assumptions, not facts. They assumed I stole the car because I was near it. They assumed I ran because I was guilty. They assumed Officer Ruiz was a reliable witness without verifying his whereabouts. But now, one by one, those assumptions are falling apart. He turned back to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, the prosecution has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that I committed this crime. And if there's one thing I've learned from every legal case I've ever studied, it's this. When doubt exists, the law is clear. The defendant must be found not guilty. Silence. Judge Grayson rubbed his temple, exhaling slowly. He looked at Carrington, then back at Jalen before finally leaning back in his chair. For the first time since the trial began, the judge wasn't smirking anymore.